My message this morning will be a reinforcement of what some of you already know. And I trust that for the rest of you, I can tell the story simply and convince you that God is still active, He's still listening and pouring out His grace upon us today. I believe God and His Holy Spirit have worked behind the scenes on a number of occasions that people say are just coincidence. Someone has defined a coincidence as a miracle for which God chooses to remain anonymous. Well, I kind of like that, really. And I'm convinced that can be seen throughout the book of Esther. One thing that makes the story of Esther thrilling is the fact that it's not fiction. It's real all the way through. Everything in that book actually happened. The book of Esther describes actual events that took place among the Jews living in the Persian Empire. The story occurs during the reign of Xerxes, ruler of Persia at the time. In fact, at that time, no ruler on earth was as powerful as he was. His empire included all of that which is now northern Greece, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, northeastern India, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Libya. He had a big kingdom. And in order to control this vast kingdom, it had been divided into 120 provinces with nobles, officials, and military leaders in each province. So our story begins with King Xerxes. In the third year of his reign, proclaiming a national festival, Esther 1:4 says, for a full 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. Historians tell us that Xerxes had brought all these nobles and officials and military leaders from throughout his kingdom for this big festival to impress them, as well as to gain their support for the raising of a 1,000,000-man army to invade Greece. Well, after this 6-month long extra big deal, big festival, Xerxes hosted a royal banquet that lasted for 7 days. And according to Esther 1:5, every man was invited, as the scripture says, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa, the capital of the kingdom. In verses 7 through 8 of Esther, wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. You see, his goal was to demonstrate the wealth of his kingdom, and to make them aware of his greatness, and to make his enemies afraid of him. When we look at verses 10 through 11 of Esther 1, it tells us that on the last day of this tremendous banquet, when the king was in high spirits from wine, in other words, he was drunk, he ordered his servants to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Think about that for a moment. He wasn't just slightly drunk, he was greatly drunk. And his motive was to impress. In fact, everything that he had done so far up to now was for show. The glory of his palace, the gold, the silver couches, the beautiful garden, his tapestries, the golden goblets, and the lavish servings of food and drink. It was to show off. And now suddenly, when he obviously was not thinking clearly, he orders his wife to come out and display herself in front of his drunken guests. She's offended by the order and refuses. That didn't make the king very happy at all. Look at verse 12. Then the king became furious and he burned with anger. By the way, if you read about Xerxes and his life, you will find that he had a terrible temper and he did a lot of very foolish things. Evidently, he felt that Vashti had embarrassed him in front of his guest. He felt like she'd made him look weak when he wanted to look strong. And so he turns to his advisors, and they told him that Vashti had done a terrible thing. So we'll take up at verses 17 and 18. For the queen's conduct will become known to all women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and the Median woman of the nobility, who had heard about the queen's conduct, will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. And King Xerxes promptly removes Vashti as queen, and then he gets busily preparing for his conquering of Greece. He raises his 1,000,000-man army and his personal bodyguard of 10,000 elite warriors called the Immortals, quote unquote. They invade Greece and they make their way south. They are sloped down at, now I can't even pronounce it, it's Thermopyle. And I pronounced it earlier. Easy. Today I'm having trouble with some of these words, so forgive me for that if you will. But they went down there with 300 brave Spartans who fight to the death. And continuing on, they take Athens and the city is burned. And it's then that things turn very bad for the Persians. An unusually terrible storm with extreme winds forced the Persian ships to bunch together in a narrow strait. A few Greek ships with Greek fire attacked, and soon the entire Persian fleet is on fire. And what the fire didn't destroy, the terrible storm did. Over 400 Persian ships were sunk, which is basically their entire navy. Now the 1,000,000-man army had no supply line. And to make matters worse, rebellions had broken out in Babylon and Egypt. And so Xerxes decided he has to get his army out of Greece as best as he can and stamp out the rebellions. Now with the storm being described as an unusually terrible storm with extreme winds, how can we explain it happening at just the exact time to end King Xerxes' invasion of Greece? It wasn't a week earlier, it wasn't a week later, it was at just this particular time, with also the news of what was happening back home. Was it coincidence? Or could it be possible that God was at work here? 4 years pass by and Xerxes is finally back home. The rebellions are over with. His kingdom is secure. He's decided to forget about Greece. Now it's time for him to stay home and enjoy life. And that includes finding a replacement for the ex-queen, Vashti. His advisors recommend that a search should be made for the most beautiful young women in the provinces. And then after a year of careful grooming in the palace, that the king choose one of them to be his new queen. And one of those chosen was a young Jewish woman by the name of Esther. When she was just a little girl, Esther became an orphan. An older cousin by the name of Mordecai took her in his own home, and he raised her as his own daughter. Well, everyone in the palace who came to know Esther was captivated by her charm, and so wasn't the king. Esther 2:17 says, now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women. She won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Once again, we wonder, was the choosing of Esther to be queen out of at least 126 other beautiful ladies a lucky coincidence? Or do you think God was at work here as well? Especially when we know the whole book of Esther. Or for that matter, that she was chosen out of all the other women in Susa, the capital of the kingdom, to be their candidate. It's very interesting when you think about it. Her cousin Mordecai had a job working near the king's gate. One day he overheard two officials plotting to assassinate the king Xerxes. He reported this back to Esther, who passed it on to the king's guards, giving credit to Mordecai. Chapter 2, verse 23 says, when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were hanged on a gallows, and all this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. Now how about someone overhearing a secret plotting of two officials to kill the king? And that's someone who is Mordecai, who passes on the information to Esther in order to save the king. Is that another coincidence? Or is that God at work? Now, as the third chapter of the book of Esther begins, we're introduced to a villain. He's ambitious, he's arrogant, and he's a cruel nobleman by the name of Haman. Haman was a favorite of the king and had been given a great seat of honor higher than any other noble. Verse 2 of chapter 3 says, all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Mordecai, as a righteous Jew, would not bow down to anyone other than God. He flatly refused to bow down to Haman. And when Mordecai's behavior got back to Haman, you can imagine how he took it. He wasn't happy. Not happy at all. In fact, he got very angry. And so Haman, he devised a plan to exterminate not just Mordecai, but to exterminate all of the Jews in the kingdom. Verse 6 of chapter 3 of Esther says, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom.
It was on mute. Sorry.
Read.
Well, sorry.
I'll accept your apology.
Thank you.
Maybe.
I can't
Our phones have their own minds, unfortunately.
This one does.
But Haman tells Xerxes, there's a group of people in the kingdom whose customs are different from all the other peoples, who do not obey the king's laws, which he was kind of stretching at because they were obedient to the Persian king. And he says, it is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. That's in verse 8. Verse 9, then he adds, if it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And Xerxes tells Haman to go ahead and do as he pleases, and gives Haman his royal seal to authorize it. And so an edict is sent out with the king's seal to destroy, kill, and annihilate all of the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day. We find that in verse 13 of chapter 3. Mordecai learns of the edict. And he tears his clothes and he sits in ashes, weeping for his people. But Mordecai isn't the only one weeping, because all throughout the kingdom the Jews were found to be weeping and sorrowful as well. Meanwhile, Esther, who is secluded in the palace, unaware of what is happening, but she hears that Mordecai is weeping and sends out an attendant to find out why. And Mordecai sends her a copy of the edict and begs her to go before King Xerxes and plead for mercy for the Jews. But Esther explains that this is not a good time to approach the king. In fact, really, there's never a good time to approach the king, because he's a very temperamental man. And she realizes she might be putting her life on the line. You see, royal protocol dictates that no one, including the queen, is allowed to enter the king's presence without his personal invitation. And it's been 30 days since she had been invited into his presence. So without an invitation, she really had good reason to fear for approaching her husband, the king. When Esther's answer was reported to Mordecai, here's what he says in verses 12 through 16 of chapter 4. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply back to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Up to this time, Esther had followed Mordecai's instructions not to tell anyone that she was a Jew. But now was the time for action, and she finally decides to put her trust in God. So during the 3 days of fasting, Esther devises a plan. If the king will see her, she will host 2 private dinners, and she will also invite Haman to attend. Then if everything goes well on the 2nd day, she would expose Haman for the cruel man that he is. She wants to get the king to repeal Haman's order to have the Jews exterminated. Well, the first plan, part of her plan, it works extremely well. The king welcomes her and he gladly accepts her invitation, and Haman does too. You said, just another coincidence? Or is God at work here? After a month of ignoring her, and we don't know why, but all at once, Xerxes welcomes his wife to come in, which is in itself unusual, but he did. And he accepts her invitation, and even accepts her suggestion that Haman also be invited to attend. I think God had a big hand in this as I look at it. And after the first dinner, Haman heads for home feeling very good about himself. He's the only one who has ever been invited to a private dinner with the king and the queen. But while Haman is on his way home, he sees Mordecai and becomes enraged all over again. And when his wife sees how angry he is, she suggests have a gallows built 75 feet high, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it, then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. It's in verse 14 of chapter 5. Haman likes that suggestion. So he orders the gallows to be built and went to bed a happy man. But at that same night, the king was having one of his nights of insomnia. In other words, he couldn't sleep. And so he called for the book of the annals of his reign to be read to him. And as he listens, he is reminded how Mordecai had saved him from assassination by 2 palace officials. In verse 3, he says, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. And so the king decided, I need to do something to honor Mordecai. After all, he saved my life. So next morning, Haman arrives at the palace, eager to get permission to hang Mordecai. But before he can do that, he is summoned by the king, and Xerxes asks him, what should be done about the man whom the king delights to honor? Verse 6 of chapter 6. Haman, of course, doesn't have a clue what the king is asking should be done to honor Mordecai. He even thinks that maybe the king wants to honor him. So Haman suggests a parade, verses 7 through 9. For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed upon its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse throughout the city gate and streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Can you imagine how Haman felt when he ends up being the one who leads Mordecai around on a horse, declaring this is how the king wants to honor the man who saved his life? Don't think that was coincidence, do you? I think the hand of God was busily at work. Well, after parading Mordecai around the city, Haman rushes home to tell his wife and his friends what happened. But while he is talking, the king's servants arrive to escort him to the second banquet that Esther had prepared. It's a wonderful feast. The king really enjoys it. And feeling quite generous, King Xerxes asks Esther once again in Esther chapter 7, 2 through 5. And it goes, as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked Queen Esther, "What is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you to grant me my life, this is my petition. And spare my people, this is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we have been merely sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" In a rage, the king leaves the room, possibly to summon some guards. Haman, realizing that his life is hanging by a thread, throws himself on the couch where Esther is reclining to beg for his life. And about that same time, the king comes back in and sees Haman on the couch by the queen and exclaims in verse 7 of chapter 8, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in my house," or in the house? King's guards, they drag Haman away, the victim of his own evil doing. Someone tells the king about the gallows that Haman had erected in his own yard for Mordecai. And the king says, "Hang Haman there." And Haman is carried away screaming. And he's hanged on his very own gallows that he intended for Mordecai. Esther then asks the king to do something about the edicts that's been sent out by Haman to kill all the Jews. And the king happily agrees. And the new royal edict is issued that all Jews throughout his kingdom are to be protected and have the right to defend themselves from any and all attackers. Esther continues, you see, to find favor with the king. Mordecai is given all the property and possession that Haman had previously enjoyed. And the Jews in every province, they celebrated. There was joy and feasting because the Jews had been spared. What a great ending to a story that's full of twists and turns, which resulted in amazing deliverance of all of God's people. So what lesson can we learn from the story of Esther? I think there's many, but I believe one major lesson is that oftentimes the things that happen in life are not just coincidences, but God at work. We sometimes think God is not involved in our daily lives because miracles seem to be so rare. But Esther's story reminds us that God can be as active today in our lives as he was in the past. And I don't just say can, I think God really is. We just don't notice it as much. You see, I firmly believe God and his Holy Spirit are actively working today. We've all sinned. We may call little sins or big ones, and we've all done things that we knew were wrong when we did them. I have, I'm sure you have as well. So God sent his Son to be the answer, to show us that God still loves us, to show us the way home and to take our punishment. Is that coincidence? Or is that God busily at work? I suggest to you very strongly, God is at work. I don't really believe in coincidences, and I don't really believe in luck. Sometimes I use those words, but I don't really believe them. I believe God had his hand in it, and he's at work. And I want to trust him with my life all the way through. I know you do too. But we have great stories to tell others about what God is doing. Not just coincidences, not just luck, or luck of the draw, as they say. It's God at work in our lives.